Hello and welcome to my makeup video for my intense failure on Thursday morning. So here we are. We are going to be talking about Chapter 7, Deviance, Crime, and Social Control. So thank you for allowing me to produce the class in this particular way. I was partway through creating this that morning and, well, off we go. So we've been talking up until this time about social groups and individuals in social groups. So here's each one of these spots represents an individual, and here's the group that they have. And the boundary that I've drawn, this red boundary, includes all the norms, values, and expectations. Now, these are known or unknown. They're socialized, they're taught. Hopefully they're all known, not unknown, but sometimes, when we join a group, we're not quite sure what the rules are. But nonetheless, there's an expectation that the individuals within this group are aware of the norms, values, and expectations of that group and will behave accordingly. They can move all about, they can do whatever they want, they get pretty close to those edges in terms of what's expected from that person, and they're still okay. However, sometimes individuals within a group will deviate and they'll go outside of those expectations. This means that their behavior is such that they're not in line with the norms, values, and expectations of that original group. And in fact, sometimes the way this happens is the individuals may join another group that has an alternative set of norms, values, and expectations. Now, anybody who's been in a family and they have a wayward child, or maybe you were that wayward child and just kind of started acting out. Now, in developmental psych, we look at this as a normal process. As individuals develop their own identity, they go through a process that really Freud actually described pretty well in a different sense, but it's still useful now. And it's called separation individuation. And it's a moving away from the core family and into an alternative sense of self that you have a much more ability to create. Now, during adolescence, which, again, according to Freud, Erikson, is the time for identity development, this can happen quite a bit as individuals are experimenting with alternative norms, expectations, and values. Nonetheless, the original group, as part of its culture, has within it a mechanism of responding to its members when those members start to act outside the norms, values, and expectations. Very simple. If you have the expectation that at the dinner table you're not supposed to be with your elbows on the table, one of those etiquette things, and you put your elbows on the table, the social control system kicks in, and someone of authority at the table is going to say, hey, get your elbows off the table. And the expectation is like, oh, okay, I just found myself in a position where I'm acting outside of compliance of the norms, values, and expectations of my family. I am going to then change my behavior so I am more in line with those, or not. So the next time someone tells you to take your elbows off the table, I would ask you to recite that to them. And so thank you for reminding me of the norms, values, and expectations of our family. I'll now modify my behavior in an effort to comply. And see how that goes over at Thanksgiving. So these mechanisms collectively, let's see if we can look at this in sort of a graphic way. Here's a leader within the family. I've given them a little fishing pole. So the leader recognizes that the other member has now acting outside of the expectations of the group, so they toss them a line. Get in touch with them, have a good talking to, remove privileges, whatever. The effort is the same. What we're trying to do is reel that person back in. Come on over here and get more in compliance with the expectations of our group. Any mechanism in our society, regardless of the size of the group, from the group all the way to our whole society, as we'll get to at the end of this, any mechanism that engages in this process of reaching out to tell people they're out of compliance and in a way reeling them back into compliance is called social control. So that's the term that we use to describe all mechanisms that do this. And we're going to describe now mechanisms. Well, we have described mechanisms within the family. There's the way the family responds, but we can also bring that out further. Institutions have expectations. Each one of your professions has expectations as to what the behavior is going to be. And let's talk about some of those as we consider social control in regard to groups. Now, I'll give you some examples of this that kind of concentrically from the field of psychology. So I have a psychology program here at KVCC, and there's a group of students in my psychology class who are all members of the psychology program. Now, there are expectations in that class. The individuals come to class, they're prepared, they take notes, they do the work, they pay attention, they don't act out, those kinds of things, those rules that happen right in the classroom. So those rules can be enforced. If anybody steps outside of that, it's up to the teacher to kind of reel that in order to manage the behavior in the class. Now, moving out one concentric circle from there, we have expectations within the program itself. So there are certain classes that you need to take. You have to take all those classes, make sure you get them all done. You have to score a certain grade in those in order for them to count toward the degree. And those kind of ideas, those kinds of rules and regulations all are the norms, values, and expectations for the program. Now, one more concentric circle outside of that is the college. Now, the college has rules and regulations regarding GPA, paying your bill, showing progress towards your degree, all the financial aid stuff, how you treat people. We have a code of conduct, both for the people who work here and for students. So there's a student code of conduct. These are all making sure everybody understands what the norms, values, and expectations are. And again, inside of that code of conduct and inside of the regulations are perhaps consequences that would happen if an individual failed to do those things. Now, let's keep going out. From there, we're in the college system, sharing this kind of world of higher education, and we fall under the regulations of the state government, the state accreditation that gives us the ability to confer degrees, the financial pieces for the entire community college system, expectations for society. So keep on going out. I have students that major in psychology. Let's say they keep on going. As they become a psychologist, they become under the umbrella of a code of ethics regarding their license as being a psychologist. So there's a whole list of things you need to comply with in order to maintain your license. And so what we see in this is just lots and lots, in a complex society like ours, we see lots of integrated aspects, all the way from paying attention in class to the kinds of behavior that you would need to maintain your professional license in your field, say as a psychologist. So see, there's lots of regulations as you expand into different groups that manage your behavior and define what are the norms and expectations and potential social control elements. Each one of those has a listing, if not in policy, certainly in practice, about what's going to happen if you step out of line. So people do step out of line. So we wonder, why? Why do people step out of line? There's a stepping out of line. Sometimes the reason for someone stepping out of line is good. They might not agree with the policies or anything like that. Here's some great examples. How about the American Revolution? How about the Civil Rights Movement? Both of these represent very large groups of people stepping outside purposefully for the sake of going against a policy that they don't believe in. And of course, if you're a Star Wars fan, the The Rebel Alliance in Star Wars battled the Empire, frying the whole Death Star. That was good. That was a good thing. So you had the Rebel Alliance representing people stepping outside of line. The Empire didn't like it, but we were all going for Luke Skywalker anyway. All right. So groups lay within a larger society. And again, just like I talked about with my explanation of all those concentric circles, we can look at each one of those groups and, even inside of those and growing outside of those, and then a larger society that also has its own norms, values, and expectations, state law, national law, those kinds of things. So let's take a look at the way deviance might manifest itself in this particular area. Now, deviance is any behavior that where a person is acting outside of the norms. Now, we saw there's good deviance, bad deviance. There's those creative deviance. Artists are often deviant. Individuals who come up with innovative answers, and we'll get to that in just a second. How do people respond to the need to be different? So kind of bringing all of this into that context, that we're not necessarily just talking about negative or bad behavior. We're talking about all the things that come to fruition when we talk about people acting outside of the norms. Now, when we're looking at the reasons why people act out, the main one that sociology identifies is strain theory. Now, strain theory essentially suggests that an individual is sitting in their situation and they are looking at the opportunities that are out in the world, and they recognize that if they stay where they are, they will not be able to get those rewards. Now, they may be financial, they may be recognition, they may be personal achievement and all that stuff. So remember to kind of look at this on both sides. So you might have an individual in a very, very bad neighborhood, in an inner city, slums kind of thing, and they're looking at people on TV driving Mercedes-Benz. And it's like, if I keep doing this, I'm not going to get what I want. I want to be able to have a nice car, have a good life. And then they enter into a choice. What am I going to do to get that? And there are both positive and negative choices that individual can make. The first one is conformity. Now, conformity means that the individual accepts the limitations of their situation and seeks to attain their goals through socially acceptable means. And what this implies is the individual sees that, looks around and say, nothing going on here. I'm gonna go to college. I'm going to go to get a different kind of job. I'm going to move out of this area, and I'm going to go to a better place and try and achieve what I want by removing myself from the norms, values, and expectations of my origins and finding a legitimate way to get to those particular goals. Another way would be innovation. These individuals either attain their goals through acceptable means, and the individual can use crime or other deviant means. So we're actually using the word innovation a little. We might not consider engaging in a life of crime to be an innovation, but I've decided to stay where I'm at, and I'm going to find a way to make that money. Now, either I'm going to become an app developer and legitimately go and be innovative and creative where I am and find something that works that way, because it's sort of the socially acceptable way, or I'm going to innovate and go into crime and other deviant ways to achieve those goals. Now, another one that we come across is called ritualism. And this is the circumstances under which individuals actually lower their aspirations and goals to those that can be attained within their circumstances. So they're going to drop the bar. So we recognize that that's how some individuals do this. Another one is Retreatism. And these are individuals who, they reject society's goals, those outside, a little bit more. It's not just a lowering of my own, it's a rejection of the outside rules and just, I'm not going to pay attention to those anymore. And we're going to see that's kind of a separation from the social agents of social control that exist within our society. And finally, we of course have rebellion. And these are individuals that seek to replace society's goals with their own. And again, we can see this as both a positive and negative instance in terms of the entire experience of social change. So there are others. Now that's kind of an expansion of the term strain theory. There are other theories associated with deviance and why we deviate, and let's kind of make our way through some of those. Now, in addition to strain theory, there's social disorganized theory or social disorganization theory. And this is when individuals become disconnected from the agents of social control, such as their family or work or school or anything like that. Society might also lose its ability to manage deviant behavior. So for instance, we're looking at the insurgent government that came into Afghanistan in just the last year. And the challenge for those, aside from the whole militant aspect of that national takeover and the removal of American forces and however all that happened, this group of people is now have the task of creating a government that manages people's behavior. Now, history has shown that fighting a war is actually a lot easier than managing a country. And the question is, can this group successfully manage their society, go into managing all the things like a modern society has, the economy, the school system, trade on the stock market, business development, all of these things, international trade, working out treaties with people, all of those things, can they do that? Or will there be a degradation of society, which seems to be, at least in the short term where things are going, where people are really struggling in that country, even to get food on the table. So that would be an example of social disorganized theory happening right now. Another reason why people might act out, cultural deviance theory, and this kind of goes with that example I used with the fishing rod. Individuals may choose another group to assign and attach themselves to that has an alternative set of norms, values, and expectations. Those alternative sets become normal in that group. So an individual, for example, that joins a biker gang or a street gang or a sewing club or whatever it is, they adopt those as alternatives maybe to the other group that they belong to. The LGBT as a category is a way in which some individuals can, sometimes they move from a family of origin that did not encompass the positive outlook and values associated with LGBT and transfer over and then adopt those as alternatives. It's a different culture within the culture that we exist. So that'd be an application of those moving and being deviant from that original group. That original group might be pretty unhappy about it, or they may be joyous about it, or maybe the group itself expands and adopts those values. All kinds of ways. The whole family, the whole group can deviate from its original value system and adopt a new one. That sort of thing can expand our minds about how this potentially could lay itself out. We have the unequal systems theory. Now, this is when individuals actually experience inequality and unfair distributions of resources and other things in our society. And we would probably imagine that this is the root of Black Lives Matter. There's a recognition of the real inequalities that exist, systemic, built-in inequalities that date back many years, if not decades, that still remain and produce a level of inequality that's unacceptable. So the deviance that then comes from that is an expression of the realization of that. It has sort of a rebellious quality. Let's change these things. Let's raise awareness. Let's change the rules. And certainly in the course book, I go through a whole list of ways in which different cities and different municipalities and what have actually taken steps to kind of erase some of the systemic things that are happening regarding race. So very important aspect of our society's changing process. The power elite is a mechanism in our society that exists where those with the most power are able to maintain inequalities and status quo. And so, again, connected to Black Lives Matter is also critical race theory, which is proposing that within these mechanisms, the power elite, which throughout our society has been largely white men, also has sort of a racial supremacist, racial elitism associated with it. I do not think that the effort of this is to shame people for any color that they have to be, whether it's black, white, or any other color that we are. But the point being that there is an elite system, and elite systems that built the structure. Think about the functional aspect of society. The structure is built to maintain itself. It's not built to crumble. And the individuals who are in power, who are largely white males, are probably reluctant to make those kinds of changes that may or may not, or even just by their perception, put them at a disadvantage. The system's working for those individuals, so therefore there's a resistance to change. And that can be the cause. Again, that Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, raising our awareness of the institutionalized aspects of racial inequality and what role we may play. As individuals, our role is in our own choices of behavior, but we can also collectively work toward identifying and changing the things in our society that perpetuate that from generation to generation. Another thing is labeling theory, and this is an interesting one because this was a very big part of my history in mental health. Now, again, those in power are able to identify and use language to identify deviance as bad. Now, you think about some of the riots that were going on during the Black Lives Movement. Now, depending on the perspective of the individual reporting, now I use the word riots. It might have been a gathering. It might have been a peaceful declaration of position. It might be, but you can use different words to describe that. So individuals, let's say, that were participating in a Black Lives Matter might have been called domestic terrorists. They might have been called rioters. They might have been called a mob. And those would be negative words labeling those particular individuals. They might have also called them demonstrators. They might, peaceful protest. They might have, all of these other words could be used by the power elite to manage the perception of those particular instances. Now, one of the things that did have different networks covering, there was certainly instances of those gatherings where violence occurred, and there are instances of those gatherings where violence did not occur. In fact, the vast majority of them. But if a news network, for example, is always showing the ones where there's a car burning or windows getting smashed, then we might presume that all of the whole movement is violent oriented, which of course it was not. So we see that labeling of things. Now in psychiatry, the labeling that we associate with diagnosing is a powerful labeling system because they're quote unquote sticky. Once an individual has been diagnosed with certain kinds of diagnoses, those can remain a very, very important part of how others see them far longer than even the symptomology really justifies. An individual who's been labeled with schizophrenia, regardless of the level of their recovery from that, successful recovery, may always be perceived of in a negative light once somebody finds out that they have that label. It kind of sticks. And the individual is in a position of, when they're applying for a job, let's say, of recognizing that, yes, I do have that part of my life. It's currently being well controlled. Do I report it to my potential employer, taking the risk that that label is going to continue to have its negative perception by the person I'm trying to get to hire me? So that can be a very, very powerful use of words, both in the media, but also in day-to-day interactions that shape the course of particular interactions. Now, another one, differential association theory. Now, this is similar to cultural deviance, where we join a new group, but this is, we can imitate individuals that we admire and imitate their deviant behavior. Now, for example, what this really recognizes, when we see this in the court system, when an individual who's a celebrity engages in behavior that's deviant and they're brought into court, a lot of the many court systems will ask those individuals to engage in community service or in some manner that will be public and presenting to try and change the public perception of that individual. Now, it may be window dressing, it might not be real, but the point is, if I really like a particular football player and they're acting out and I think that's cool, then if I see that football player saying, no, that wasn't cool, this was not good, and I'm going to engage in this behavior to fight that particular thing that I did. So maybe I will think, I'll join with that individual. I still like them as a player, and I'll think, well, maybe that wasn't cool, and they were in error to engage in that behavior. The validation of that, the actual practice of giving those kind of things, validates the reality of differential association theory when we pick people to follow who are deviant. And the last one here is control theory. Control theory is a larger model, but within this particular application, similar to social disorganized theory, but rather than removing themselves from society, it is a focusing of energies on the things that I control, the things I can control. I may act out because there are things out of my control, so I'm going to grip onto the things I have control. I'm going to grip onto them very strong. So let's say there's a veteran who went through wartime, PTSD, struggling in life, and then the help that might be available is available through the VA, but they reject that because that's not only is it a real source of their trauma, but it might, my ability to say no to these individuals is the last remnant of control I have over this situation. So I'm going to hold on tight to that piece of control that gives me legitimacy and power in that particular situation, even though we might be sitting there as social workers, and I have sat there in social workers and say, this is great opportunity to get treatment, great opportunity to move on, and because it's the VA, I need to exercise. I may not vocalize this, but they need to exercise that piece of power they have over the government or over the VA itself. And so these are the ways in which we recognize and describe social deviance. These are the reasons why people act outside of the norms. Now let's take a look here again. We have our society, we have an individual within a group, and sometimes they act outside the group. And the group has some responsibility, or they have a mechanism of social control. But what if they act outside of society's norms? They're way out, further from their group, but even outside of society, and we call that crime. So a crime is everything that we've been talking about up until now. All those reasons apply to crime. All these apply to any sort of deviance that we've engaged in, but the deviance is recognized within the code of law. So we have mechanisms in our society, we have institutions within our society that are essentially social control mechanisms. Not only our jobs, not only our job policy manuals and stuff like that, but really society-wide mechanisms for identifying what is appropriate behavior and providing consequences for acting outside of those. Now, those manifest in our law, the actual script of the law. The police are charged with capturing, enforcing, identifying, reminding, ticketing people who are deviant. The government largely controls the actual creation of the law, and we do that democratically. The court system interprets the details of the situation in order to come to the best resolution. And our entire criminal justice system and all its nuances serves to rectify, punish, reward, and create the expectations for individuals who engage in crime. Now, I really want to talk about, you have the law, which can be drawn very specifically or very narrowly, or it can be very broad. And so our Constitution, for example, identifies rights and responsibilities for the government, rights and responsibilities for people, and it prescribes general aspects of how these individuals are to behave. Modern actions sometimes don't fit neatly into those boxes, and sometimes there are circumstances under which maybe the deviant behavior that I was engaging in is justified. So we have a court system. So rather than the law being applied black and white, we actually have the ability to go to a court and argue our point and say, no, I didn't do that, or I did it under these circumstances. And the court system is charged with recognizing when a crime really is a crime and when it's not. In addition to that, we have the criminal justice system that then responds either through allocating resources to work with individuals to rehabilitate them, they're that big fishing rod bringing people back in. Maybe there are institutions like jails and probation that serve to bring people back into normal action. Their prison system, the jail system, each one of those, the different levels of security that individuals need, all of this system, the district attorneys, all of that serve to manage deviant behavior and provide the most fair and equitable way of delivering justice. And so these are ways in which our society manages this at a very, very large scale. So there's a quiz for this particular chapter, and that quiz is asking you to think about some things. I want you to pick a group, and I want you to imagine that you're exercising behavior outside of that group. Pick whatever behavior you want. You're totally free. It could be elbows on the table. What happens? What rules are critical? And how do you get back in? You might even explore things that there are some rules in our families that are, the elbows on the table. I mean, you put the elbows on the table, just continual reminder, kind of thing. Nobody's going to get kicked out of the family, hopefully, for that. But let's say you're in a very Democratic or a very Republican family, and you suddenly are, you're working on the campaign for the opposite. That could create quite a lot of conflict. In fact, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen families really struggling as different individuals have had different political affiliations. It could be any sort of deviance, you're dating someone that they don't approve of, or you've married somebody that they don't approve of, that you're going into, everybody's a lawyer in the family and you want to be a social worker, that kind of, you're acting outside. That was actually an example. I had an individual in my mental health program when I was running that, and there was they came from a family of attorneys. Everybody in the family was an attorney. She did not like that kind of work, didn't like what she saw. It wasn't negative, just didn't feel enthralled by that, wanted to go into social work instead, and received quite a lot of flack, including the notion that they weren't going to pay for the school. If the family, if they said, we'll pay for your school, but only if you go into law. So she had to break away from her family. One of the responses of that, one of the social controls, was we're not going to pay for your school. That was meant to bring her back, right? We'll pay for your school, be a lawyer, go with it, and then no problem. She decided not to. She still stayed deviant. And she said it continues to make waves in the family. Why are you doing that? She accepted the consequences. She's going to have to put herself through school. As unfair as you and I might think that is, but off she went and she became a social worker. So that individual acted outside of the family expectations, and there were consequences. So in the quiz for Chapter 7, I'm asking you to reflect on that. So if we look at what's due for this particular chapter, we have the Chapter 7 quiz, which asks you to do just what I've been talking about. So I hope this has been a sufficient exploration of deviance and social control, and I will see you folks in a couple weeks, I think in a week and a half or something. So I'll see you later. Take care.